Okay, Joel, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the first Monday for August 2023. I am Joel Fishman, President of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. We are delighted to have so many of you online today for this First Monday program, brought to you by the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the University of Southern California Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Our guest today is Kate Wright, Associate Professor of Media and Communications in the Politics and International Relations Department at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Wright will discuss her new Oxford University Press book, a book I am looking forward to reading, Capturing the News, Trump and the Voice of America. Today's tech host is Claudia Del Pozo. Claudia will be backed up by our Tom Tuck fellow, Gabby Stahl. I offer a big welcome to Gabby, who just moved into the DC area 3 days ago. As always, for this webinar format, please put substantive questions in the Q&A box and technical questions in the chat box. That's substantive questions in the Q&A box, technical questions in the chat box. Our moderator today is William Lafay-Humans, Associate Professor at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs and the Director of the Institute of Public Diplomacy and Global Communication at GWU. Over to you, Will.
Thank you so much for this wonderful event. I am delighted to be moderating it, and I know that there will probably be a lot of questions, so I'll do my best to make sure that everyone's questions get answered in a timely fashion. I did want to add that along with Dr. Wright, her two co-authors will be joining today. One of them will be here the whole time for this presentation. That's Martin Scott, Senior Lecturer in Media and International Development at the University of East Anglia. And then later, maybe for the Q&A, joining us from a conference will be the other co-author, Dr. Mel Bunce, Reader in Journalism at the City University of London. I don't have a whole much more to say. I want to jump right into this, and then I'll see you on the other side of the presentation when we'll be doing the Q&A. So, Dr. Wright, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi there, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, and we can get started talking. Hopefully this is going to work. Can you all see my slides okay?
Yes.
Great. It's working. I like it when it works. Hi, I'm honored to be speaking with you here today. My co-author Martin is here. Mel Bunce is unfortunately at a conference, so she may drop in later. We're going to be speaking to you about our forthcoming book, which is going to be published with Oxford University Press. We don't have a date yet. We're hoping early 2024. I know I've had some inquiries from some of you about why it's not up on the pre-sales page just yet. And the answer is because it's currently going through legal checks before we go into production. I'm sure you can appreciate this is a really sensitive area, and we want to make sure we're not only scrupulously fair, but we also avoid any legal risk. We have media liability insurance, but we prefer not to have to use it. So in this book, we explore what happened during what was quite controversial period when a Trump appointee called Michael Pack was running USAGM. And that was from June 2020 until January 2021, shortly after President Biden was inaugurated. And to do that, we used 20 semi-structured interviews with VOA senior managers and journalists. We do quite a lot of media analysis, and we also analyze 15,000 pages of documentation. Now, 12,000 pages from that were from Freedom of Information archives that other people had made. And bear in mind, this period was the height of COVID, when most people were working from home remotely a lot of the time. So some conversations which might have been had in person were had through those messages, and we have a record of them. And there are some quite detailed conversations which are really illuminating between Michael Pack and his team, between PAC's team and VOA staff, between PAC's team and some White House officials, and between PAC's team and some members of the media, including right-wing media. As a researcher, that's really exciting, a very, very rich archive to be looking at. But it was important for other reasons as well. It was important because we needed to verify, sometimes modify, sometimes challenge what our interviews were telling us. And it was also important for political balance, because at the time when we were doing our empirical research, an Office of Special Counsel investigation was going on, which was highly sensitive and looked like it might possibly lead to further charges. So we took what for us was a very difficult decision not to approach Mr. PAC or any other member of his team or some other people, because we didn't want to disrupt that investigation in any way. So what we did was we filled in their perspectives from their internal communication to balance out what we were looking at. Now, the lens that we used to do our analysis is called government capture, but I need to explain what that means. It refers to the increased politicization of media. It doesn't mean the total capture, so it doesn't mean, pure propaganda. In fact, there was some important forms of resistance to politicization, which we can talk about later. And it doesn't mean that VOA was ever apolitical, not political at all. I used to work for BBC World Service, and any international public service media network involves some political considerations, which relate to why it's funded in the first place, what its diplomatic remit is, which countries it targets, and which languages it focuses on. So that's why we use this particular lens. These are the research questions that we asked, and I can't go into everything in detail in this speech because it's only 20 minutes. I can't cover a full 100,000 word book. In particular, please bear in mind there's a full chapter on the history of VOA and a history on the resistance strategies which some members of VOA chose to pursue. So I'm just going to focus on some of the key findings today, and if there's anything else that you're interested in, please do ask me some questions about that. Now, when we're talking about the extent of politicization, primarily what we're talking about in this book is journalists self-censoring themselves. And this is consistent with previous studies of politicization. Even the English language newsroom, which kind of held up best, if you like, under pressure, lapsed into some forms of self-censorship. And these map onto what we've come across in a previous case with the South African Broadcasting Corporation under Jacob Zuma. So, for example, journalists in the newsroom tended to focus most on very straightforward, event-focused reports leading up to the election. They refrained from doing what they would normally do, which would be background explanations or analysis pieces. They relied quite deliberately on safe sources, especially wire agency material, and they tended to, in some cases, start moving towards what we might call false balance or false equivalence, particularly when it came to their coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests, where under some pressure, they started to cover the violent protests in Portland one day and peaceful protests the next day, even though they knew that the Portland protests were not representative of the protests as a whole happening across the US. But most of all, they just reported much less on the US election. They were very nervous about what they were trying to do. They checked and treble checked everything they did, which meant they only put out maybe a couple of reports of the US on the US election per day. But it's really when we get to the language services that the most serious forms of self-censorship start occurring. But I want to be careful here because I don't want to overgeneralize. There were some language services and some journalists within it who just quietly kept doing their jobs. But there were others who responded to the pressure they were under in quite a serious way. Some journalists in language services stopped pitching any US stories at all. Not even just not political ones, no stories about the US. Some journalists in language services stopped doing any original reporting at all. They simply translated what the English Language News Centre produced or wire agency copy. And we came across one case, which we verified, where a single language service deleted tens of online stories because they were so worried about getting into trouble. Now, those of you who haven't been in journalism before might not realize this is incredibly unusual. If, as a journalist, you make a mistake, normal practice is to issue a correction and be transparent about that. You don't just take the story down. To give you an example, the only time I have come across a journalist panicking about getting into trouble and removing stories was when I did field work in CGTN, which is a China-led network in Nairobi. But why might VOA journalists start doing this? Let's have a look at the kinds of things that shaped their decision-making. There were some direct interventions which Mr. Pack and/or members of his team started to make. We found evidence that there were some concerns or questions, complaints raised about the political balance, particularly in relation to Black Lives Matter, and suggestions about how journalists might like to respond instead so they would not be perceived as being biased by Trump supporters. There was one attempt to access an election planning file by one of Mr. Pack's attorneys, which I should add was firmly rebuffed by the news editor in charge. There were, as you probably read in the press, disciplinary investigations into specific reports and specific individuals. And I should stress here, though, that not all of these investigations were unreasonable. The first in particular, into an Urdu video, was concerning. The item in question was politically unbalanced, and VOA managers had already started to investigate it. What was problematic potentially about these investigations was that it broke existing policy in USAGM and in VOA, which was designed to carry out investigations in a way that insulated journalists from any possible perceptions of political pressure. It certainly was experienced by journalists within VOA as intimidating, and this was picked up on by the Columbia District Court, which ruled that Mr. Pack and his team should not intervene any further in editorial matters in VOA because they were infringing journalists' constitutional right to freedom of expression. And the last one, which you may have read about in the US press, was a change to a federal rule. It's a rule in the US Federal Register about how the firewall should operate. But notably, that doesn't entail a change to the law. But what we found was the reasons why these interventions had the effect they did on journalists, stimulating this self-censorship, was that journalists were already struggling to cope with several changes which were occurring to their working environment. And I'll go through them now. The first change to their working environment was the increased politicization of their governance structures. There was a change in the law, which happened quite late under the Obama administration, which transferred all authority from the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which had been bipartisan, to a single appointee, a CEO of USAGM. Now, if you look at the details of that law, which is the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017, it's really woolly. It's really vaguely phrased. It's overly, in our opinion, open to interpretation, and it doesn't clarify a lot of terms that are used. That change in the law allowed Mr. Pack to bring in several political appointees, and he used quite a few civil service practices to do this. So he brought some people over on detail from other agencies. He employed other consultants. In total, we counted 14 appointees, which then formed what he called the USAGM front office. Now, the Office of Special Counsel has criticized some of these practices, saying that they were overly informal and that some of those who had significant decision-making power weren't even USAGM employees at all. Certainly what happened after that is that the majority of long-standing executives in USAGM were suspended for allegations which have since been disproved. Those individuals have been cleared and either reinstated or one is retired. And one significant person who was the head of editorial standards was reassigned to other duties. Now, again, that's a civil service practice. That's quite common within, I am told, within the US civil service, but it was a significant source of concern for VOA, particularly because VOA wasn't allowed to backfill Springer's position. And we saw this politicization of governance structures escalate again when in December, after the election, the VOA Director and Deputy Director position were filled by 2 political appointees. Now that is traditionally allowed, but we did find that under their supervision, governance capture increased again, because these people as a whole were then in a position to reinterpret what was quite a vaguely worded law and related laws around it, such as the International Broadcasting Act, and to reinterpret what we argue is quite a vaguely worded charter, to reprioritize certain things and deprioritize other things. Other changes to journalists' working environment came about because of the capture or increased politicization of their resources, particularly their financial and human resources. Now, what happened during a previous period of increased politicization was that VOA's support services, including HR, IT, contracts, legal, were all moved into USAGM. And that meant that there was already a kind of bureaucratic bottleneck at USAGM. So that when Mr. Pack announced a review of finances and of staffing, there was very little VOA could do about that. And it was not unusual for such a review to take place, but it was unusual for it to go on for 7 months. There were also concerns about the J1 visas that are needed to employ foreign journalists by VOA, whether that was giving them to new appointees or renewing them for VOA staff who are already existing. Now that's quite a complex area, and there had been concerns about the vetting procedures of how VOA and USAGM were coping with this in the past. But what we would say is the effect of it was that some language services, not all language services, became quite short-staffed. They became overstretched. Those language services also already had more people who were freelancing, more people who were on fixed-term contracts, and there were difficulties with paying them. And those language service staff became very concerned about whether their visa would be renewed. So language services were under a lot more pressure than the English language service staff. And the consequences for them of losing their livelihood were obviously much more serious if they risked being sent back to, in some cases, the authoritarian countries they came from. And also because of the way that IT is structured in USAGM, the servers are in USAGM, which meant that rumors of surveillance of VOA staff by USAGM kind of ran riot. And some VOA staff became very nervous and very paranoid, particularly in this sort of remote working circumstances during COVID. We do know that the suspended USAGM executives had their private emails turned over to a private law firm, and that's discussed in the OSC report. And the final thing that really changed journalists' working environment was how the purpose of VOA and its relationship to government was discussed in the broader media, in US media, and particularly in right-wing media. Mr. Pack made several media contributions, gave several interviews to the right-wing media, and Mr. Reilly also wrote an op-ed while he was in office. You've probably read about Mr. Pack's suggestion that USAGM might potentially be a home for foreign agents, or at least a target for foreign agents. That hit the headlines in the US. To be honest, that didn't surprise us that much. There have been numerous allegations of spies in the past. Sometimes there's been some evidence to back that. Sometimes there really hasn't. We're not surprised it came up again. What was more concerning from our point of view as scholars was the way in which this was used to justify greater intervention by executive agencies, alongside allegations about a drift to the left and implied resistance from federal employees. Now, that tended to be termed loosely in terms of the swamp or globalists rather than deep state, but to us it looks like it is of the same piece of that kind of argument. However, any claims that were being made by Mr. Pack or Mr. Reilly were wildly exaggerated by some sections of the right-wing media. What you're looking at here is a network analysis of the Twitter spread of a claim that the Voice of America gave President Biden a platform to call US Muslims to jihad. We also know that thousands were spreading this on Facebook within a matter of days, and that there was widespread commentary about this on some right-wing blogs. And this happened just 3 weeks before the election. It's a wild exaggeration of Mr. Pack's original claim, which was that he raised concerns about the Urdu video, which I mentioned earlier, that it lacked political balance, and that it might potentially influence some Muslim voters in Michigan, which is the state where Mr. Biden had given that speech. The number one at the center is Gateway Pundit, which was one of the key sites that we found spread really wild exaggerations about VOA. And most of the large clusters you can see in different colors around the outside continuing to spread these Twitters about this conspiracy theory are pro-Trump bots, or at least they appear to be pro-Trump bots. We don't know really who operated them. It may have been foreign actors. We don't know. But this is what they appear to be. So what I've explained to you here are some of the direct interventions that Mr. Pack and his team believe they were legally entitled to make, the impact it had on VOA journalists, and why it had such impact because of these changes to their working environment, in which at least some VOA journalists were very overworked, they were under-resourced, they felt under attack by many different sections of the media, they believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were being subject to digital surveillance, and they were just chronically stressed out. This was a quote from one VOA manager who spoke to us, who said, "There was one time when I came home and my wife opened the door for me and she just started crying. And she said, 'This stress is going to kill you.'" And I think that's what's not come out of previous studies of government capture. There's not been that inside perspective of what it actually does to journalists, the level of mental health issues that some of our respondents reported. But more broadly, we think our findings are important for a number of different reasons. Number one, I think they make us think again about what constitutes an effective firewall. Because many of the things which journalists experienced as pressure were not actually editorial interventions. There were changes to their working environment, this whole ecosystem of interacting factors. Number two, when we're looking at those changes to journalists' working environment, there are very strong, repeated, consistent correspondences between what happened to VOA during Michael Pack's time in office and several other previous cases of capture in national and international public service media. In our book, we have a chapter looking at the UK, where I'm from, Hungary, Poland, Japan, Slovakia, South Africa, and Turkey. And you can trace quite a lot of parallels. Interestingly, most of those countries were also going through processes of de-democratization at the time. So I don't think we can quite talk about a playbook of de-democratization or a recipe book, but we can talk about common chords or common themes that keep coming round that we need to be aware of. Does this then prove, is the question, that there was some nefarious plot to turn the Voice of America into the voice of Trump? We don't actually think so. What we found was much more ad hoc, much more piecemeal, much more chaotic, as was much in the Trump administration. The changes to journalists' working environment often came about through exchanges through different groups. It didn't seem to be centrally organized or centrally coordinated. Indeed, when we looked at the emails between Mr. Pack and his immediate colleagues, we found what we believe is evidence that they genuinely believed that they were correcting liberal bias and corruption. So what can we say to that? We can say perhaps that it is possible to be sincere about what you're doing, but also to be sincerely wrong about the effect that you are having. Now, the last point, perhaps, about why this matters. Although Mr. Pack and his immediate colleagues have departed from office, we've argued that this wasn't just on them. There were many different interacting groups involved. And we would agree with some of our respondents that they are still not safe from increased politicization at a future point in time, despite some of the legal changes that have happened since. We think that there are far more changes that need to be made to protect VOA in future. And we think that VOA is still far too easy for a US administration which has authoritarian tendencies to try and capture. And having captured it, we would also argue that it would actually be comparatively easy to convert the network into a major domestic news organization. So we think unless US lawmakers are very careful, they could end up in a situation where VOA was indeed converted into state media. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Wright. As a moderator, I'm going to take my privilege and just ask a couple questions before going to our attendees. I'm very curious about, these strategies of resistance of politicization. And yeah, I really also appreciate the sort of cross-national comparisons as someone who has worked on Al Jazeera English in particular. In Qatar, it was interesting to think of some of these common themes about how staff, how reporters, editors, producers, other kinds of talent working within these highly politicized contexts, how they have some sort of agency still to try to resist and to craft areas of independence. I wonder if you could say a little more about those particular tactics and what was kind of most effective.
Thanks, Will. I mean, I think it's, we sort of looked at two different groups of strategies. We looked at externally focused strategies and we looked at internally focused strategies. The externally focused ones were the very broad range of them, and that's really unusual if we look at previous research into government capture, and it's also very unusual for managers to be involved. So there were legal cases, including the Columbia District Court case that I mentioned. There were formal whistleblower complaints to a number of government bodies. There was work with a civil society body called the Government Accountability Project. And there were leaks, repeated leaks to the US media and Congress. And I think all of those have borne fruit in some ways in the longer term, but in the short term, they didn't really do very much, particularly the sort of formal moderate strategies. They just took too long to emerge. They took a year or more to emerge. And of course, you want an investigation to be scrupulously fair and bipartisan. But what we were looking at here was increased politicization happening so quickly, it needed an intervention faster than that. In terms of internal strategies, there were different ones, and there were rows between VOA staff who preferred internal strategies and those who preferred external strategies. There were several members of staff who wanted to focus purely on upholding good practice, good governance. They didn't see this as politicization. Some of those we interviewed were pro-Trump. And they wanted to stake by, say, the disciplinary processes which had been agreed. Other members of staff wanted to engage with Mr. Pack and his team in a diplomatic manner. Perhaps there were misunderstandings there. Perhaps they didn't quite understand the impact that their action was having on staff. But I think the one that is perhaps quite difficult for VOA at the moment is what we call hidden transcripts, which look like external compliance, but actually involve hidden methods of resistance. And they seem to be used quite widely by journalists, by managers, and by other employees. And that could involve, say, trickery, for example. The Pompeo speech, which you may have read about in January, is quite controversial. There's evidence that the hyperlink to that was quite deliberately buried because people were very uncomfortable about live streaming in full without any critique or any analysis the speech of Mike Pompeo. But most commonly there was kind of slow walking. I don't know if you've come across this phrase before, kind of dragging your heat a bit, just playing things out a little bit. So one key example of that is we found unsubstantiated evidence that Elizabeth Robbins, who was then the deputy director of VOA, tried to bring in a number of people very, very quickly, literally in the days before President Biden was inaugurated, very quickly going around some of the security vetting processes, asking to get people in really quickly. And some of the non-journalists we spoke to said, look, we think this is off. We're not sure about this. So we're just going to make sure that they go through all the security vetting processes. We're just going to make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed, because this feels wrong to us to be rushing through political appointees so late in the game. But I think that leads me on to the fact that this is not a VOA book. That is actually quite uncomfortable for them, and I think was justified in the circumstances. It was an emergency, but it's really not a sustainable resistance strategy. It's not a way we want to encourage going forward in a democracy. But I understand why they did it, and I think given the link to de-democratization, it was an emergency break. But it's not something we need to encourage going forward.
We have one question from an attendee that dovetails with what I was going to ask next. This is from David Enser, who used to be here at GW managing the project on national security and media, and is a career accomplished journalist. What type of protection, in parentheses, legislation, ? Would you advocate for in order to strengthen the firewall against interference in VOA journalism?
That's a great question, and it's kind of why we did it, David. I mean, as you may be able to tell from our attribution, none of us is American. We don't have a political dog in this fight at all. None of us want to work from American universities. Sorry, Will. I like Scotland. I'm staying here. But we did think this is really important, not least because it highlights what is actually quite an important truth, which is traditionally we think about the firewall as protecting editorial activity, right? But what the study of capture, including but not limited to this study, shows us is that actually capture's more of a system. It's more of like almost an ecosystem in which different factors interact with one another all the time. So what do I think needs to be done? Okay, I'm going to show myself up to be a little bit radical here. Again, I may not make myself popular at this point. I really don't think that VOA's director or deputy director should be politicals. I think that is asking for trouble in terms of future disciplinary investigations and the way in which they are experienced by staff. I think we need to keep political appointees out of VOA altogether. I think we need to move VOA support services back inside the organization. They were moved out of the organization into USAGM during a previous period of politicization under the Reagan era, and I think they need to come back in order to avoid any suspicion that staff are under surveillance or that HR is being used to target people. I think they need to come back in-house. There's a real need for clarifying the accumulated body of law. It's pretty bad, to be honest, particularly the International Broadcasting Act. If I could just quote from you here from Judge Howell. She said, "The IBA as it is currently written is a mess which fails to define what the highest professional standards of journalism are, or how these standards should be reconciled with the expectation that US-funded international media operate in accordance with US foreign policy." It's just far too open to interpretation. You know, I don't think Mr. Pack was operating against the law as far as I can see, that remit is so broad, it can be easily reinterpreted. I think we need to strengthen the provisions of the Hatch Act, which currently have high-level appointees, including Senate confirmed appointees, referred up to the sitting president. That doesn't work if you have a bad faith president. I think we need to strengthen congressional powers of the purse so that they can cut off funds if they think it's being misused. I think we might even consider updating the charter, which pulls you in 3 different ways at once. And I think given how important working conditions are, we might want to consider having trade unions representatives on the BBG, or as some other international public service broadcasters do. But above all, I think we need to train journalists and their managers not to think in this very simplistic binary way. It's inside the firewall, which is editorial, or it's out. They need to understand how this whole ecosystem works.
Thank you. We have a few questions here that I want to read. One of them, which is actually about 3 different questions, are from Daniel Robinson. Very quickly, just to summarize, it says here that Michael Pack and a key member of his team did not know about this book until recently. Is your book really just filling in their perspectives, or did you really consult them? So is their perspective really just, from given or from them? Sorry, I'm trying to summarize it because these are rather lengthy. You say that USAGM-VOA appointed a liaison person and a 3-person team to review an early draft. So you allowed the agency pre-publication vetting, but you did not contact citizen journalists who wrote about political bias in the content, who covered the consultant's report prepared for then VOA Director Bennett that revealed concerns about political bias, ? Not sure. And the third one is about critical coverage of Trump and PAC coming from the VOA. Did authors review that kind of content? I think, that's a good question about content analysis. How did you account for this kind of critical coverage? Does it kind of go against the theory of capture in this instance?
I'll do the first one, and I just want a clarification on the third, but I'll do the first 2.
Okay.
So, did I consult them? So this was a really big ethical question for us. When you're sampling as a researcher rather than journalist, bear in mind I'm working as an academic researcher here, you need to be very clear about the rationale for your sample, who's in it, who's not. You don't kind of riff around it the way I used to as a journalist with who's relevant, right? What you're looking for is a systematic category of people. And our sample was affected people who were willing to talk to us. We were well aware that that was potentially politically biased. So what we did was we subbed in the perspectives from correspondents. That was a big decision for us. It was one that was hard to make, but the OSC investigation was going on at the time. This was really highly sensitive into, gross mismanagement, misuse of funds, potentially criminal or civil lawsuits coming. And one of the first kind of rules that I try to follow is sort of do no harm. And, if we had derailed that process for the sake of our book, I would have found that incredibly selfish and self-absorbed. And I try and be socially alert. So that's the decision we took. It was a difficult decision, and we have been transparent about it. But no, we didn't contact them because the OSC report was ongoing. It was live, and we did not want to put anyone off talking to those investigators or complicate that in any way. In terms of, I'm really glad, Dan, that you asked us about the contract. So we have a hyperlink that will be in the book explaining exactly what we did and didn't do, because I think the best thing is that we're just transparent about it. No research which is engaged in such sensitive issues is going to be perfect. And I think the best thing is just to be transparent about the limitations of your study. So we did this research under contract with USAGM. It was not a consultancy contract. This was our book, and that was very, very clear, to the point when we insisted in writing that they could not ask us, invite us, veto us. There was no organizational approval. There was no sign off. If they didn't like something in the book, they didn't get a right to ask us to remove it. And to be honest, they have stood by that. I've been actually really impressed because there are some difficult things in this book for them, and they have stood by that. We gave a couple of people, designated people who were not part of the study, the right to review one early draft. And again, the nature of that engagement is quite carefully specified in law, in the contract, that they were allowed to identify anything which was inaccurate and give us proof of that, any context that they believe was misleading and give us proof of that, and we were not obliged to change a thing. One other thing that we added later, it's not in the contract, is if anybody was identifiable who had not consented to be identifiable, because we don't want to wreck anyone's career. So those were the rules of engagement. If you think they're unfair, you're entitled to your opinion. I have quoted you, by the way, and some of your concerns, if that helps. And I didn't quite understand the last question. Could you clarify that for me, Will?
Yeah, essentially it's the question is about critical coverage of then President Trump and PAC. So VOA English news reporters and editors published numerous articles, video and audio reports that were critical of them, even when PAC was in charge, right up to the Biden administration. Did the authors review any of this content? How is this consistent with your premise that VOA was captured by the Trump administration?
Oh, wow, that's a tricky one. So I didn't include, I'm trying to think, I didn't include many articles as references. I didn't want to include them as authoritative references because they were coming from a place, right? They weren't part of the study of capture. They were included in the chapter which considers resistance to capture, because that was the motivation and intention of those actors. But I focused on leaks to the media in particular, because that is a designated strategy that is being discussed in previous cases. I hope that answers your question, Dan.
So Professor Cull, one of our collaborators on First Monday Forum, has unsurprisingly perhaps a historical question about your historical perspective on whether you saw the PAC crisis as worse than the two major crises at VOA, those associated with the McCarthy investigation and the difficult experiences of the early Reagan period.
Hi, Nick. Nick has been wonderful by correspondence, keeping me right on my historical details. And I very much appreciate his support and input into this book, not least because I'm not American and there were things that I could easily get wrong. Do I think this crisis is worse? No, I don't. I think the McCarthy era was easily worse. The Reagan era arguably was worse. It is not new for VOA to experience periods of increased politicization, as indeed other international public service media have done, because its remit is so confused, to be honest, and people are pulling in different ways at once. What is different about this time, and I think it will be really interesting, Nick, to see what you think about this, is that I think the emergence of social and online media means that the audiences of VOA are changing. You know, once upon a time, we could bracket off VOA audiences as overseas, right? And think about it purely in terms of democracy. But when we looked at data for voanews.com from SimilarWeb, we could see that in 2020, the country that referred most traffic to voanews.com was America. Now, we can argue some of that has to do with internet circumvention tools, right? We know that a lot of Iranians, for example, use internet circumvention tools. So they may look like that they're in the US, but they're not. And if you look at the time when that traffic happens, there's a big spike in the middle of the night, right when Iran comes online. So that might be a little bit misleading. But if you look at data, for example, for Deutsche Welle or France Radio Internationale, they've got the same thing happening in 2020. Their funding countries, Germany and France, are the most common referring countries. So we have to change how we think about the effects of these kinds of organizations, because domestic audiences are seeking out that content, as are overseas audiences. It's a mixed kind of audience. I don't want to overblow this, VOA is not Fox News. I don't want to give the impression that there are huge audiences out there for VOA. There aren't. They're small, but they exist, and I think that is significant. So I think it's not so much that it's worse, a period of increased politicization, but it's happening in a different media and political context where we've got these mixed audiences starting to come, either because they're following particular searches on Google, and if you use similar web data, you can see what searches they were using in 2020, or they're diasporic audiences who are looking for news in their mother tongues. So I think it's happening in a different context. And this is why I think actually VOA's charter, we might need to revisit it, because we can't just think about VOA in relation to public diplomacy anymore. We also need to think about it in relation to domestic politics. Do you
Very
find that a
good.
convincing answer, Nick?
We have another question here from Matthew Wallen. To what degree do you think foreign audiences understand or are aware of the effects of these management debates at VOA or USAGM broadly? At what point do these debates factor into the actual perceived credibility of USAGM broadcasters by these foreign audiences? So a good question about audience effects.
Gee, that's a great question. I haven't studied overseas audiences' responses to VOA or how aware or not aware they are of what happened and of some of the debates around what happened, right? Because you might interpret this differently from a different standpoint. I know that there was international news coverage of it. Certainly here in the UK, we got some international news coverage, but I wouldn't know about kind of audiences around the world. So this is a fancy way of saying I don't know. I'm sorry.
Some of the audience research I've seen, at least in the air world, for example, is that there's a complex diet. People think, oh, I want to get the American opinion. I go to the U.S. sources, and they counterbalance it with other sort of opinions. So I think people are much more savvy viewers of news information than sometimes we give them credit for. We have another question here from our VP at PDCA, Larry Wallers. During the Cold War, there was a bipartisan sense that, quote, politics stopped at the water's edge, unquote. That sense is not only gone, but the politicians of one political party believe that news coverage that many of us would perceive as nonpartisan is in fact biased against them, this hostile media effect. In that context, is there still a viable role for a nonpartisan government-run media platform? So, a very good question about the feasibility of the ideal model given the larger political culture.
Wow, these are great questions. I think it's a great piece by Daniel Kreis, who's not here today, which is about the crisis of epistemology, which talks about if you're coming from a very polarized, very partisan perspective, that you tend to assess truth and reality in relation to that perspective. And that's really troubling, because what that does is it forces us further and further apart. And it destroys this idea that there's any possibility for a common meeting ground where we can meet and listen to each other's views. I'm BBC trained. My editor used to make me get the papers that were opposite from my political opinion, which won't map onto the US at all. And I still hold to that as a discipline. I think it is really important that in any democracy and any representation of democracy, we are listening to each other. Otherwise, we're heading down a very nasty, slippery slope. And I think let's look at the bigger picture here, I would argue. China's not messing around. Russia's not messing around. Iran's not messing around in terms of how much money they are pumping into media. Are there bigger values, democratic values, about the virtues of debate, of rational, critical debate, which we should be upholding, regardless and above how we vote? I actually think there are, maybe I'm a dreamer, but I think there are.
Thank you. I mean, related to that is this kind of question about, could the VOA evolve into, a valuable sort of domestic news organization? I mean, maybe there's a need there given the polarization within media. Of course, public broadcasting is something that's been difficult to maintain in the US, given the political economy of media and government appetite for that and the taxpayers, et cetera. So I'm just curious what you think about the plausibility of that kind of alternative future.
Yeah, I think Sean Powers published a paper on this some time ago, 2011, I think. It's an interesting argument. There are clearly news deserts in the US, if I can still use that phrase. International news is always a loss leader. It's really expensive. No advertiser wants to advertise against, the war in Syria or whatever. It's not, you can't put your luxury watches against that. It's very difficult to fund commercially. So there has to be some other way of funding it. And Martin and I and Mel have done some other work around foundation funded journalism. So we've looked at lots of different models. I think with VOA, if it was fully separated from political appointees and there were further measures to protect it, maybe we could have that conversation. At the moment, I think it would be too dangerous. I think I want to be clear here. I am not inferring that Mr. Pack or any other member of his team intended to turn VOA into a domestic broadcaster. I need to be really clear about that. But when we started to look at it, and I was looking at the laws around it, and I thought, hang on, these are toothless. These are really toothless. What would there be if there was a government of either party which had authoritarian leanings? What would there be to stop somebody, other than, breaking the law in principle, thinking about the Smith-Mundt Act here? If you're prepared to break the law in principle, what would there be to stop you using VOA to target US citizens? And the answer is very little. Very little. There are laws there, but they're really hard to enforce.
We don't have any other questions from the attendees. Did we want to invite Martin to add anything? I know it's a lot of pressure.
Martin, you're sitting there,
We have a few minutes left.
And we are always 16.
Sorry, Martin, to call you out like that.
No, it's all Kate. Kate has been word for word any of my responses. There are some other questions, some really good ones. Maybe Kate could have a go at answering. I believe your recommendations about actions VOA should take in the future are excellent. What do you think the chances are that these recommendations will be implemented at VOA? And that's the most recent one to come in. What's going to happen next? Question.
That's a good one.
I think I don't know if it's ever going to be politically acceptable for a VOA director not to be a political appointee. What do you think, Will?
What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think the US, I think there's a question of in principle, and then there's a question of what's happening at the current time.
Yeah.
What happens at the current time is the US has so many problems right now. My concern is this will fall off the agenda. I think for most of Americans, including actually VOA staff, willingly said to us, people don't know what VOA does. Most people don't care, unless you're really a public diplomacy wonk. You're not that bothered. It doesn't seem to impinge on your life that much. So I wouldn't see it at the moment as being a high priority. My concern is that because it's not a high priority, if it's not protected, it would be very easy to use it if somebody were so minded.
At a time when it's so important, at a time when Kate was describing earlier about the information services from China and Russia, and USAGM isn't the only agency that has domestic challenges. So it's just such an important time for international public service journalism. There's another one which I think I know Kate's answer to. Why was it unsuccessful? Why does Dr. Wright believe the politicization of USAGM VOA reduced after Pack left?
I think it's difficult to talk about success and not success because we don't have a clear indication of intentionality. Without seeing inside people's mind, we can't see what they intended. I think what we can say is factually what happened, which is that President Biden asked Mr. Pak to leave office shortly after his inauguration. There are still lingering problems. One of the things we haven't touched on is that politicization doesn't really stop when those who oversaw it, and I use that word carefully, I won't say did it, I will say oversaw it because it involved lots of different actors, left. So one of the things that we found in the study was that at the time we did the interviews, VOA staff were continuing to leave in droves. They were losing a lot of staff. You know, that may now have reversed, which would be interesting to find out. But there was a sense, particularly amongst the VOA staff we spoke with in 2022, they were still being very careful about what they did. They were avoiding anything that might be perceived as biased, which meant they were not doing analytical pieces, they were not doing critical reporting, they were not acting as a watchdog in any way, because they just didn't know what was going to happen in the future. I don't think there's a perception that there's an over-personalization of capture, I think, and that is dangerous. And I think the US media has contributed to this by making this a Mr. Pak thing or a whoever else thing. It's a system. It's a system. It may not be intentional. It may be quite messy. It may be lots of groups interacting with one another in particular ways. But if it's producing those effects, it's capture.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking time to present this book with us, and we're really looking forward to it coming out in early 2024, as we can best predict so far. At this point, I wanted to invite Joan Maurer of PDCA and various other affiliations, if you want to share those, to close this out. So welcome, Joan. Unmute. I think you're muted. I'm sorry, Joan, you're on mute. You're muted.
Am I there? Am I unmuted now?
You are unmuted now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. This was a fantastic discussion, and look forward to the book and look forward to lots of questions and further comments about this topic. And the best place to do that is going to be on September 11th, when we have confirmed that Amanda Bennett, the new CEO of USAGM, will be at a hybrid program. It will be in person as well as on Zoom, in person at the Elliott School. Thank you, Will. It'll be our first Monday. It won't be the first Monday because that's Labor Day. It will be September the 11th at 12. And this is really one of the first major appearances that Amanda is going to be doing to talk about how things have changed and how she's moved on from 3 years ago. I think Pak must have left 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago now. Unfortunately, we're facing another election next year. But there have been a lot of very positive changes. A lot of good things are going on at USAGM. And I'm sure Amanda will share those with us, including, you know, really reach into Russian language people, to audiences, to China. So she's been very engaged, as well as in sort of trying to cement a better, a less toxic work environment. So we look forward to Amanda. We've really enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to the book, Kate. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes the First Monday Forum. We'll see you next month.